everyone. It's great to have everybody join us for yet another very exciting Fubon Center Fireside Chat. And today we're joined by Dr. William Hait from Johnson & Johnson, where he is the Executive Vice President, the Chief External Innovation and Medical Safety Officer. Dr. Hait serves on the Executive Committee at J&J and oversees the Innovation, Office of Chief Medical Officer, and the Interventional Oncology groups. Bill, thank you for being with us today.
Great to be here, Melissa. Thanks for having me.
So, I mean, is it okay if I call you Bill, first of all? I had Bill in my notes here, but I just want to make sure that's okay.
Absolutely fine. As long as I can call you Melissa.
Please call me Melissa. So, you know, first of all, most people know the name Johnson & Johnson for its consumer products. I grew up using Johnson's baby powder and baby shampoo, and I think you have had a lot of brand equity invested in that name. But I know that recently you guys divested a lot of your consumer products. So what does Johnson & Johnson look like now?
Yeah, that's such an important question because, as you pointed out, Melissa, we were best known for those baby products. It really created enormous trust in our company since moms tended to use baby shampoo, baby wash, from the moment they brought the kids home from the hospital. So that was really great. But last year we spun the consumer part of J&J out into a new company called Kenvue. And what we have now, we're still the largest healthcare company focused on two major areas, pharmaceuticals and medical devices. And if I can have this, a slide pulled up, I'll give you a sense of the amazing breadth of a company like Johnson & Johnson. So last year, we invested over $15 billion in R&D, just to give you a sense.
Wow.
And that's just in Med Tech and Pharmaceuticals. Our worldwide sales in these two parts of J&J, Med Tech and Pharmaceuticals, were over $85 billion. And we really are a global company with over 460 million patients treated globally. And we have about 130,000 employees spread around the world. So as you can see, it's quite a massive enterprise now focused completely on pharmaceuticals and med tech. What the problem that we're dealing with now is no one really knew that J&J did all this. They knew about the baby products, and they knew about Neutrogena, Vino, Tylenol perhaps, but they never really, or few really associated Janssen Pharmaceuticals with J&J, because Janssen Pharmaceuticals was the pharmaceutical part of J&J. Or AccuVision contact lenses, the largest vision contact lens maker in the world, making over 5 billion contact lenses each year with Johnson & Johnson, or big parts of the device business like Ethicon. Every medical student learns to suture with Ethicon sutures, and on and on and on and on. So that's now the challenge for the new J&J.
To become known for that or to manage all that? Yeah.
Become known for it and always to manage all that.
So I understand that you lead the enterprise R&D segment of the organization, and that includes those three groups we talked about before. I think it was innovation, oncology, and med tech. Is that the third one? Well, anyway, I was just going to ask, that's a lot of hats. That's a lot of hats you're wearing. Do you want to maybe talk to us? We don't probably have time to go through all three of them in detail, but since we have an innovation fireside series here, do you want to maybe talk to us a little bit about the innovation part? Sure.
So the three parts that we're talking about were the Office of the Chief Medical Officer. So I serve as the Chief Medical Officer, in Johnson & Johnson Innovation, which I'll focus on in a minute, and interventional oncology, which I can also tell you about. So Johnson & Johnson Innovation is comprised of three parts. And these three parts are how we partner with people around the world who are developing products that we're interested in. What we learned, and you'll see in this slide, what we learned was that no company, even one as big as ours, can possibly capture all the innovation needed to continuously make great products and keep the company moving in the right direction. So we created what's called Johnson & Johnson Innovation to take advantage of the numbers game. I'll give you an example. So within our Janssen, our pharmaceutical group, it's now called Johnson & Johnson Innovative Medicines, we had about approximately 300 discovery projects to support the pipeline. For a recent oncology conference in Europe, and not the major oncology conference either, we received 2,000 inquiries from companies or people who wanted to meet with us to tell us about what they were doing to potentially partner with us. So it's a numbers game, and there's so many opportunities around the world that we need to take advantage of. And to do that, we created four basic tools. One are innovation centers, which are partnering offices located in innovation hubs, Cambridge, Massachusetts, South San Francisco, London, and Shanghai. We created incubators called J-Labs, and we have 8 of them all around the world. And then we have our business development group, like most companies do for mergers and acquisitions. And then we have a venture fund, actually the industry's first venture fund called JJDC, where we can make equity investments in all sorts of companies so we can stay very close to these innovations and gain a right of first refusal as we learn more and more. So this is our innovation model, at least the external innovation piece of it.
Okay. And so, when we teach organizing for innovation in class at Stern, we often talk a bit about the degree to which innovation is centralized versus decentralized and the trade-offs that you get there. Like centralized might be good for big systemic projects that you want to be uniform across the whole company, but decentralized is really good for tapping local knowledge and getting that entrepreneurial spirit. Would you say that Johnson & Johnson is doing a blend of these, or do you think it leans more heavily one direction or the other?
I think it's a blend. It's very important that, at least from my point of view, that within the company, we have very deep R&D expertise. And the reason, and these people are critical for 2 reasons. One is they can organically grow drugs or devices, but 2, they can help us evaluate opportunities on the outside because they have the expertise. And if you don't have that within your company, you can be fooled more often than you would think when an opportunity comes your way, but you really don't have the expertise to evaluate it. So I think we have a pretty good balance, and we're very fortunate that we've been very successful at it.
That's terrific. It's interesting. Students often want to know, like, what metrics are used to choose projects or how firms decide, because you probably get a lot of different opportunities and suggestions and ideas. And, maybe everything sounds great, right? And I remember there's this great quote by Steve Jobs. It says strategy is really about what you say no to. Strategy is about saying no to 100 things, right? So that really highlights how important it is to make careful decisions. How does Johnson & Johnson make those kinds of decisions? And is it the same across the organization, or is there a lot of leeway given to different groups to make those decisions differently? I mean, can you give us some insight into that?
Sure. So as you point out, we see many, many, many exciting opportunities from very excited people who are living their dream. And we have boiled it down and actually published the paper, Paul Stoffels and I, in Nature.
Wait, what's it called?
The paper was about strategic partnering, and it's in Nature Communications, and we certainly can get it to you. But we laid out 4 criteria that we use, only 4, to make it as simple as possible for people coming our way. And we want them to know exactly how we're evaluating them. The first question is, when your asset works, will it be transformative? In other words, if it's not, or if it's going to be similar or me too, given the fact that it takes a long time to get these things to market and market expectations change with time, by the time these things get to market, if they're not really unbelievable, there's going to be no value to them.
Wow, that's such a good point. Is that you're saying because the product development time on a medical product is so long that it really only makes sense to go for the home runs. Is that what you're saying? You have to aim for the fences every time.
Really going to change people's lives.
Wow.
So that's the first criteria. The second is the quality of the science and the scientific team. And we look very hard at who are these people coming to talk to us? What's their track record? The science that they're talking to us about, how good does it look? How rigorous have they been? And then we add another factor. We've shown often very important that as these early startups begin, that they bring in an entrepreneur, someone who has done this before, who can help them navigate, because it's very tricky. That's number two. The third is, we call it, for better or for worse, the killer experiment or the de-risking experiment. Is there an experiment that, if it works, life is going to get a lot better for everybody? If it doesn't mean that their idea will never work. But what it does mean, it's going to take more time and it's going to take more money. And for us, that's an opportunity cost, because we look at so many early opportunities that we're going to pass and move on, but we would fund them to that next decision point, to do that de-risking experiment. And then finally, the fourth thing, are the deal terms fair? What do we mean by that? We at J&J, as you can imagine, we have very sophisticated people in transactions and legal and finance. We've done hundreds, probably thousands of deals. And many of the people who come talk to us are right out of their postdocs or just starting. And we don't want to fool them. We don't want to take advantage of them, because ultimately they'll figure that out and they'll never come back to us again. So we actually spend a lot of time making sure that the deal terms are consistent with comparables of similar deals, that they're suddenly that the originators don't lose their shirts and don't give away so much in equity. And when we do that, they keep coming back to us time and time again. And that's been a real key to our success.
So how much does the ability to protect intellectual property factor in? Does it need to be patentable or patented? And do you guys think much about like moat, competitive advantage? Does it have to be something where you feel like there's low risk of somebody else coming in on your heels and imitating it?
Yes, very important. We take a hard look at what their patent estate is, who holds the patents. If it's held by a university, for example, how easy is that university to work with? That's
are they usually easy to work with or not?
Very variable. Some are good at it, some are less experienced and can take more and more time, and time is money in this area. So very important. There are times when know-how is as important as IP estate. So they're less common, I would say, than the deals where there's some IP.
Okay. All right. So do you have an example? Can you share an example with us? Or, would be even really great, although if you don't have an example that comes to mind, I totally understand, because whenever somebody puts me on the spot for an example, that's when my mind goes blank. Right. But has there ever been a project you passed on and then you thought, oh my God, you saw it come to market with somebody else and you thought, oh, that would have been great, we shouldn't have passed on it? Or is there one that you're particularly proud of not passing on and bringing to market?
Never happens to us. Just so I'll give you an example. So we have these incubators called J Labs. We have them all over the world. And it's a very interesting model where we we have people apply to get a position in the J Labs, and it's no strings attached. There's no strings to Johnson & Johnson. We don't take any rights. We don't take anything. They come in, and they have access to remarkable facilities, instrumentation, educational programs. We have something called an investment hub where they get to speak to venture capitalists and investment banks. We work with them on their pitch. And
Wow.
over the years, the first one started 12 years ago. Believe it or not, we've incubated 1,000 companies.
Wow.
And these companies have raised in secured and unsecured investments over $100 billion.
Wow.
And very few have come to J&J, maybe a dozen. So there are many that have gone in other directions. It's too early to know if any of them will become blockbuster drugs or the best device ever for coronary artery. We don't know, but you can see it is a very large pool from which we get to choose, and we don't always choose correctly. I'll give you one that we're very proud of. We found a very early company that was making a peptide drug that could work something like an anti-cytokine. In other words, these drugs that block inflammation.
Mm.
And we worked with this company. We licensed their asset. We got it in-house, and we found by tweaking it a little bit with our in-house experts, we made it into something that looks really, really promising for autoimmune diseases. So it works from time to time. We wish it worked more often, but it shows you it's a very risky business. You know, of all the drugs that make it into the clinic, 90% fail once they're in the clinic. And of the drugs in the lab that go from the laboratory into phase 1, only 5% or so make it from the lab into the clinic. So we're talking about a 99% failure rate plus. So it is a tough business. And so it takes a lot, as you saw, a lot of people, a lot of experts, and a lot of money to be successful. And we've launched on average about 2 to 3 new drugs a year and many devices per year. So it can be done, but it's not easy.
So at least once a year, a student or a team of students comes to me and they have a new product idea. And often there's at least one person in the team that has some background in medicine or biology. So they have enough knowledge to get them into trouble, right? And they want to know what to do, how to get started, how do they get this made or developed or funded. If I sent him to J Labs, what are the odds? I mean, of that, you say you take 1,000, you incubate about 1,000 companies total or a year? Is that what you said? Total. So how many applications are you turning away? Like, what's the acceptance rate of that program?
I guess we probably turn away about 90%.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The reason is that we're looking for companies, for startups that are consistent with our strategic interests. So many of them are terrific, but they're just outside our areas of interest.
So it has to be within the treatment areas or the capability areas that you guys focus on.
Yes. Now, not 100%, but that's our highest priority.
And it has to be extraordinarily promising.
Absolutely.
And how far down the, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
It's so much fun to visit the J Labs and meet with these people.
Is that an invitation?
Yeah, we have one in New York. You'd be welcome to visit.
I would love to do that. I'm going to get some calls from people watching this video too, who want to come with me, I'm sure.
Yeah.
How far down the development path, when someone comes to J Labs, how far down the development path are they usually? Are they like at the idea stage, or they've got a prototype, or they are trying to scale? Like, what's sort of the sweet spot?
They're very early. Most of these companies are very early. Many of them have friends and family money, angel money, and haven't gone for their first seed round even. So they're very small with the hopes and dreams that they'll get better and bigger, and we'll do everything we possibly can to help them along the way. We hope that at the end of the day, they'll be grateful to us and come to us first for a deal.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So what would you say are the hardest parts of your job? By the way, one of my MBA students told me that you have his dream job, and I'm sure he's in the audience watching now. So I hope he puts something in. By the way, everyone, we have a Q&A section. So please, if you have questions, pop them into the Q&A area so that when we get to the tail end of this, we can call on you. But I'm sure he is here watching. What are some of the best parts of, or the hardest parts of your job? Best parts, hardest parts.
Yeah. So it's a great job if you can get it. I paid my dues in the company. I joined 17 years ago. I was the head of R&D for the farm sector. I started the oncology therapeutic area. And having done all of that, I got to go into this wonderful area of innovation. What's great about it is I get to see the most promising ideas that our team has already sorted through, and they would come to me when it's time to decide, do we take it forward to try to make a deal? So it's a great job. The hardest thing is to disappoint people. But we can see they have great ideas and great passion, but sometimes they just don't work, or sometimes it's not for us. But overall, it's a wonderful job if you can get it.
Yeah. So just because a project doesn't meet the high standards of Johnson & Johnson doesn't mean that it doesn't have commercial opportunity, I presume. So is it the case that some of these projects that you end up passing on or exiting from go on to still make it to market another way?
Sure. I mean, you can tell companies as good as us are offering a lot of money to some of these companies that we've incubated. So it's likely that more consistent with their strategy than ours, or our strategic areas than ours. They see something in it that we didn't see. There's many reasons. So there's absolutely, I would guess that a good number of these companies will do extremely well.
Cool.
Yeah.
So when we teach new product development management at Stern, we often talk a lot about team structure and whether teams are full-time or part-time and cross-functional and heavyweight or autonomous, things like that. And we talk a little bit about team size, which seems to vary a lot across different companies. What to you are sort of the makers of a great team? Like, how big should it be? How diverse should it be? Should it be people's full-time job, or should it be should they also have a different functional line job and then serve on this team? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So I think diversity is critical because you want people from diverse backgrounds because they'll think about projects differently. So I think that's very, very important. And we actually look for that in some of these JLab companies that come to us. We actually ask, how diverse, is your board, and this, that, and the other thing. So I think that's very, very important. I think the single most important thing, in my opinion, is very deep expertise in every part of the team. And I'll tell you why. It's such a tough thing to get let's say a drug to market. I've referred to it as it's like an Olympic sport. The degree of difficulty is a 10 and the competition is global. So you really have to have, whether it's the medicinal chemist or the biotechnologist or the regulatory scientist or the clinical trialists, every one of or the people who work on the product development, well, CMC, that actually will eventually, could the thing be manufactured at scale? Every one of those people have to have extraordinary expertise. And if there's a weak link, what we find is things don't work because this is a tough business. And you can't be, it's not for amateurs. You have to have people who really know what they're doing. Second thing that I'll give you my own bias and what's been so successful at J&J is very deep disease expertise. So people have great ideas, but they won't know what disease it'll be good for. They often tell me that'll be good for every disease, and nothing that I've seen is very good for every disease yet. So really understanding a disease in detail. And that usually requires a physician who really has been in medical oncology or on the device side, who's been an interventional cardiologist or a CT surgeon or a rheumatologist, on the pharmaceutical side. That deep expertise is so critical because these people know exactly what's needed. And if you just work like some companies, and we used to do it ourselves, but we moved away from it, on just the fundamental science alone, you won't know at the end of the day how your asset, what patients it will be good for. You'll be guessing. And there's no room for guessing in this business. You actually have to know what you're doing. And we're fortunate at J&J. We have so many people who are so talented, but it's just like the other companies. They all have great talent or they wouldn't exist.
It sounds like you're describing teams that would be pretty big. And I'm going to contrast that to, I take a group of tech MBAs out to the West Coast every January, and we go visit all the tech firms. And, we always hear about like the 2-pizza team. Like Jeff Bezos wants his teams to never be bigger than 2 pizzas, meaning you could feed them with 2 pizzas.
Right.
I suspect your teams are going to need a lot more pizza.
A little bigger. So we call them compound development teams. And they probably have around 10 people on them.
Oh, it's not huge then.
Not huge, no.
Yeah. All right. Also, I think another contrast that's interesting to point out is lately a lot of people are focused on technology that's all based on software. And so you hear a lot about agile development. And it's funny because historically, in my studies on innovation, firms usually talked about stage gate, which is kind of the opposite of agile, right? Stage gate is very linear with these. First, we figure out the product design. And when we got that figured out, we can start on the process design. And when we have that figured out, we start working on the commercialization steps. And it was because of the escalation in cost and risk that happens as you go down that path. And it seems like the model in software is just entirely different, right? It's a lot of iteration. You break the problem down into modules and you work on them in parallel and you try stuff out, you throw it against a wall, you see what sticks. Am I characterizing it correctly, do you think?
Yeah, I think
contrast there?
That is the contrast, because unfortunately we don't get to try out a product. We have to, before we can treat a patient, we have to go through a very rigorous process with the FDA or regulatory agencies around the world. And they're terrific. You hear a lot of criticism from a lot of people, but they're great. They have deep expertise. They see everything. So we may bring a drug to them. They've probably seen several other drugs that are similar. And they'll know where the problems lie, and they try to be very helpful. They're very rigorous. So you have to go through that process. So there's not as much iteration as you would like once you get into the clinic. Before you get to the clinic, definitely. When you're in the lab, if you're a medicinal chemist, using, our chemical library probably has 1 billion plus chemicals that are being tested to see how they bind to a specific target. Everything now is automated. A lot of AI and machine learning goes into it, trying to select structures that humans wouldn't have probably thought about. But they sometimes actually bind to the target pretty well, and that kind of AI-powered chemistry and even biotechnology is moving forward now.
So I'm sure a bunch of ears just pricked up when you said AI. Is there any chance you tell us a little bit more about how Johnson & Johnson got involved in harnessing the power of AI for, I guess we're talking about drug development right now, right?
Yeah, we can start with drug development, but we can do devices too. So let's start with drug development. The problem with many important targets they're difficult to make a drug against that will actually either inhibit the target or activate the target. They're just not accessible. They don't have a good pocket to stick the drug in, or they don't stick out of the cell in a large enough way to make an antibody against. And gene editing can be very difficult in some circumstances. So we've called upon AI and machine learning. And we say, well, here's the problem. And we can give the machines three-dimensional crystal structures. And we say, make us a drug. And we collaborate with a lot of companies in that space as well. And they come back with structures that don't fit any of the criteria for a drug. These are called the Lipinski's Rules of Five. They don't look like drugs. We wouldn't have imagined them as drugs. But when we start testing them, some of them actually look pretty good.
Wow.
They can be tweaked. So this is fantastic, fantastic. In our device sector, everything is becoming powered through digital tools, through sensors, through feedback to the operator, through feedback to the instruments. I'll give you one remarkable example. So one of the, and this is the interventional oncology area that you mentioned, that I have the privilege of also leading, where it reports to me. So we started with lung cancer and asked, well, why can't we cure lung cancer? And the reason was we diagnosed it too late. So how do we diagnose it earlier? And now with CT screening, CAT scan screening of high-risk patients, you actually can pick up these nodules very early, and some of them are cancer, but you don't know which ones, and they're way out in the periphery of the lung that the standard bronchoscope can't reach. Okay, so how do we solve the problem? We found a company that makes a robotic bronchoscope that we refer to as a pulmonoscope, because it can do for the lung what the colonoscope does for the colon. This thing can go anywhere in the lung, all the way out to the periphery, because it telescopes. And once it gets there, it can biopsy for a diagnosis, and there are ways to utilize the scope for treatment, either with energy, with drugs, with oncolytic viruses. So all powered through the use of AI and other tools to take a CAT scan and turn it into a three-dimensional depiction of the lung, and then use a GPS system to navigate our way out to the lesion. I mean, it's really cool stuff.
But it must take so long to get stuff like that actually into practice. I wrote a case years ago on the camera pill, and it's made by Given Imaging. And I was like, oh, everybody's going to prefer a camera pill, because who wants to have a colonoscopy? And there's also a big part of the gut you can't even get to from either end. So a camera pill sounds like a great idea. But it's very hard to find camera pill in practice. Like if you try to call around, you won't find a doctor that will offer it. So, and I think this is because there's extreme risk aversion in the hospitals and physician systems, and getting it approved by insurance, right? Or what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. So for in the farm sector, it's a little bit different than diagnostic sector and devices. In the farm sector, if you have a game-changing drug, it gets picked up very, very quickly.
Oh, really?
Very quickly.
Wow.
Yeah. Some of our drugs, as soon as they're approved, we start shipping the next day, and they quickly ramp up. In the device sector, the device can be approved, but now the surgeons have to decide whether they like it or not.
Yeah.
And it takes a while before the market tells you whether that's going to be a popular device, right?
Yeah.
In the diagnostic space, it's even more complicated in a sense, because the question for the pill, let's say that the camera pill, how many colon cancers are you willing to miss? What's the positive predictive value, the negative predictive value, the sensitivity, the specificity? And when you start talking about diseases that are fatal if you miss them, people and physicians tend to be pretty risk averse.
Yeah, that makes sense. I figured it was because of the learning and the physical investment. My father's a general practitioner, and I know that once he's bought something, he wants to use that thing for a while. You know, he's not in a hurry to upgrade to something where he's going to have to make a new investment and learn to use it all over again. But you know, there's an interesting trade-off that you're talking about, because on the one, so the camera pill, if we go back to, which I know better than your lung one, but so there's a higher risk of missing something, but you'd also get more people to do early screening because it's easy to do, right? So that's a different kinds of risk trade-offs there, I suspect.
You would hope. You would hope. Again, it's the, you know, if you think about it in the most simple terms, how sensitive it is. In other words, do you miss any if a lesion exists, and how specific it is. In other words, you don't call benign something malignant. Yeah. And if you start looking at the actual numbers, that determines the utility of a diagnostic. So, for example, let's say it misses a certain percentage, that has a risk. But let's say it calls malignant what was benign, that could lead to a big workup, expensive workup, and even surgery unnecessarily. So that's what makes that space quite complicated. And when you have a well-entrenched system with endoscopy and colonoscopy, it's hard to break in.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
You know, I'm going to spring a question on you that you might not know the answer to, but I'm sure my students are wondering, and that is, to what degree is J&J getting involved in gene editing or like monoclonal antibody, you know, treatments for cancer? Like how is it, how much is any of that playing into you guys' strategy?
Sure. So we were one of the early companies to develop monoclonal antibodies. The first one was Remicade, and now we have a whole slew of them. To do it, we acquired a company many years ago called Centocor, and they were one of the first to produce monoclonals for therapeutic use. So it's a big part of our portfolio. It's probably more than half. Wow. In terms of gene editing, we use gene editing all the time in the laboratory to test whether a target is important. So let's say you think that this target is really important in the growth of cancer cells, and then you edit it out, and the cancer cells grow just as well. You know that it's not that important. You can also use gene editing to place certain mutations in genes that would occur in patients, and then test if your drug works against those mutations. So in the laboratory, we use it all the time. The other parts of gene editing that people are excited about, which I am too, would be for inherited genetic disorders like sickle cell. The sickle cell is a really good one because it's a single base in one gene, so it's pretty easy to edit out. The problem is, once you edit that gene out in a hematopoietic stem cell, you then have to do a bone marrow transplant, right? You have to wipe out the person's bone marrow to put in the new edited marrow, edited stem cells. So it's a big, expensive deal. It will get better. People are studying how to do this, how to edit genes just by injecting certain editing tools directly into a patient that would find the disease and edit out the bad gene. All coming somewhat in the future, but we're involved in many of these things to stay at the cutting edge.
Yeah, I guess I'm an optimist. I thought we would already have, I thought as soon as I learned about CRISPR and zinc finger nucleases, I thought monogenic diseases are toast. They'll be gone in 10 years. Mm-hmm. And that was at least 10 years ago. So I guess I was a little bit over optimistic.
It will happen. It will happen. It will just take a little more time.
Wow. So is there anything that you're excited about in the future of medicine, or Johnson & Johnson in particular? Anything that we should watch for in the news that's kind of, cool, exciting stuff?
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you what I'm most excited about, and I've been excited about it for a long time, but I haven't gotten anywhere with it. So I practiced medicine. I'm a medical oncologist and an internist for about 30 years before I joined J&J. And I never had a patient come to see me once who said, you know, Dr. Hait, I'm so happy that I've been diagnosed with cancer so you can treat me. They always would say, I don't smoke, I don't drink, no one in my family have cancer. How could I have prevented this? And I'm convinced that we will, as a species, evolve to the point where it will no longer be acceptable to wait until we get a disease, until we do something about it. You
Yeah.
know, 100 years from now, they're going to look back at us and they're going to say, really? They used to wait until they got a disease? What were they thinking?
Until they knew they had it, right? By that point, you get it like so much earlier than you know that you've gotten it.
So what's going to happen, I think? If I were to start all over again, this is where I'd be working. Using genomics, proteomics, any kind of omics, people are more and more knowing the diseases to which they're at high risk, right? And then the question will become, okay, what can we do about it? So we never actually realize that risk, right? We never realize that we never get the disease. And I think the next Johnson & Johnson, hopefully our Johnson & Johnson, will answer those questions. Here's what you can do about it. And here's our products that will stop you from ever getting the disease to which you're at very high risk. That's what I think is extremely exciting. And I think that's where the young people at NYU, at the Stern School, they've got, if they're going to change the world, which they should, be thinking about, that's how they'll do it, not by making another drug to treat, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Other people are doing that.
So it's already working with BRCA. I know several people who got, genotyped for the BRCA gene and preemptively got mastectomies because they weren't willing to take that risk. You're saying for a much broader range of cancers, people should preemptively find out what their risk is.
Not just cancers. You can, when you do depending how you had your genome sequenced, they will tell you all sorts of things you're at risk for.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's really interesting. So should we remind the audience to go get genotyped? Is that something that you're doing these days, telling people to get genotyped?
Not necessarily, because I'm always telling people, don't do anything until when you get the result, you can do something about it. You're right. And
don't tell me news I don't want to hear if I can't do anything about it.
Right. But if you're told you're at risk for type 2 diabetes, sure, you would be more assiduous about your weight and about exercise. I think, so I'm fine when people get their genome sequenced. I had mine sequenced because I wanted to be sure that my daughters hadn't inherited a gene from my mother because she had ovarian cancer at a young age. Wow. So I made sure that I didn't have it and wouldn't pass it on to my kids.
Well, you've sold me. I'm definitely going to do it right away. We have some questions in the Q&A, so let's just get to some of those real quick before we run out of time. Okay, so we have a question here that says, oh, I'm glad this came up. Laura Sumner says, whenever a competitor has success, for example, Ozempic, does it demotivate you or your teams? Or is an understanding that hyper-focus on specific therapeutic areas is critical in order to show up well and not be spread too thin? And I'm really hoping you end up talking about Ozempic more generally too, because I think that's kind of a controversial drug. So I'll hand that to you.
So I can tell you my own feeling, and I think it's shared by many of us at J&J. When a company comes out with a really fabulous drug, of course, we wish it was us, but we're also happy for all the patients that can benefit. So I think that's consistent with the J&J credo, and I think most of the people who work at J&J would feel that way. But that doesn't mean we're not going to jump in. In fact, we had a whole program in obesity, and now that's going to be looked at again now that we've seen the success of the incretins, because there's more to come. And the thing that I particularly like about obesity is that it is the underlying factor for so many diseases.
Yes.
For diabetes, cardiovascular disease, osteoarthritis, cancer is the second highest risk factor for cancer, right after tobacco, and on and on and on. So it's great, and I think that many companies should continue to innovate around that space. The hyper focus that the questioner also, was it Laura, asked, was very important. I do think that, as I mentioned earlier, that companies are well served when they know a lot about a few diseases, not every disease, rather than taking a drug and trying to find all the different diseases that it may or may not work in.
Yeah.
So because of the incretins, Ozempic, semaglutide is one of the several on the market. By the way, Ozempic is not approved for weight loss, just in case you didn't know. It's approved for diabetes, type 2 diabetes. But the same drug at a higher dose is, so Wegovy, I think it's called. So these are great drugs. I think it's going to be the next generation, which will be probably safer, probably less muscle wasting. The problem with the drugs now is that you lose a lot of weight. You lose a tremendous amount of weight. You have to stay on them, but because when you stop, you rapidly gain the weight back, but you gain the fat back. You don't gain the muscle that you lost. And that's a real problem. So you got to really think about that. So we're looking at muscle sparing forms of these drugs, and also people who go on the incretins need to be sure that they're eating enough protein, that they're exercising, because they're losing muscle as well as fat.
I was very skeptical of any drug that increases your resting insulin. I think there could be follow-on problems with that because hyperinsulinemia is implicated in other problems, But that's a conversation for another day, I suppose. I have to, unless you want to say something about it.
The reason it doesn't happen that often is these people, remember, the approval was initially for people with type 2 diabetes, so they don't make much insulin, or they're insulin resistant. So it's been less, hypoglycemia has been less of a problem than many of us, yourself included, would have anticipated so far.
So Miriam Moshiri asks, do you have any advice for physicians trying to pivot into the healthcare industry?
Yeah, thanks, Miriam, for the question. I'm a physician who pivoted into the healthcare industry. I would say you have to understand the differences of either practicing or staying in the university and being an academic physician. There are big differences. They're different, very different worlds, and you have to prepare yourself. So in industry, you need to really understand research. And if you're a physician, at the very least, you have to understand clinical research, and you really have to understand the biology underlying the diseases. So you have to prepare yourself. I was very fortunate because I was either smart enough or stupid enough at the time to do both an MD and a PhD, and that prepared me well because I understood the science pretty well, and I understood the medical problems pretty well. That kind of preparation helps. So I would say at this young age, when you're still in graduate school, there's time to broaden your foundation to prepare yourself for a career in industry, or for that matter, career in academics.
Okay. Colton Margus asks, he says, first of all, thanks for speaking with us. Given the time it takes to bring products from bench to bedside, how at such an early stage as with JLab companies, are you able to think of the strategic long-term for Johnson & Johnson and for human health? And as a follow-up, how do you decide when in-house versus M&A, mergers and acquisitions, makes more sense, thinking of the recent Shockwave acquisition?
Yeah, good question, Colton. So number one, you're correct. These very early projects, if they're going to be successful on the pharmaceutical side, will take about 10 years. Plus, they'll take about $2 billion in investment, just to give you a sense.
Only $2 billion.
Yeah, so it's very expensive, very risky. So you're right. It is not for the faint of heart. And as a result, you need a very large number of opportunities that are incubating to fill your pipeline. So at J&J, if we have to launch 3 drugs a year, which is about what we need to do, we have to have 40 unique drugs in phase 1 every year. So you can't possibly do it all organically, right? You can't do it all in your own labs. No company, even as one as big as we are, is going to get 40 new drugs into the clinic every year. So you have to do both. And, to answer your question. Now,
Wow.
what about mergers and acquisitions or licenses, let's say? So let's say the Shockwave acquisition was done for a very specific reason. J&J is determined to build a very deep portfolio in the cardiovascular space. So it was a strategic move to acquire Shockwave. We acquired Abiomed, we acquired Laminar. So we're on the hunt for exciting opportunities. That's why they were done. Going back to the pharmaceutical group, if you look at that funnel of 40 drugs in phase 1 to get one out the other side, one into the market, you can disrupt that by licensing a late-stage asset or acquiring a company with late-stage assets. So that's the balance that you do to make sure your pipeline is sufficient enough to keep the business growing.
So it requires tremendous scale to be successful in your field, it sounds like you're saying.
Yeah, and by the way, I just mentioned that keep the business growing. And Stern is a business school. These companies are very big businesses, very big. So they're run like businesses. And not to forget that.
Yeah, cool. Tatiana Canessa asks, what piece of advice can you give early innovators or startups to become great leaders?
Thanks, Tatiana. Just to clarify, are you saying great leaders of the startup or great leaders? Let's assume for a second it's great leaders of a startup or something like that. Yeah, if that's the question, it's a question about leadership. I'm sure you get plenty of advice, plenty of programs about leadership. I really don't know the secret sauce, but I'll give you something that has served me well over the years. I make sure that the members of my team know that I'm knocking myself out to make them successful. They tell me the 3 top goals of the year, and they tell me what I have to do to make sure they achieve those goals. And I'll work like crazy to make sure that they succeed. Why do I do that? One is if they're not successful, what will happen to me as their leader, right? Number 2 is it changes the dynamic. I'm not sitting in judgment of the people who report to me. I'm working like crazy with them to help them in any way. And I think that leadership style creates followership. People will really stick with you because not everything works, as we just talked about. So that's one approach that I've used over the years from my time back at the university to current time.
I love that because it's so general and like it works everywhere. And it's a change of mindset. That's really cool. I wrote it down. I'm gonna tell people that.
Right, because you hate it if you have a boss where every time you see him you shudder. Her.
Yeah. So Robert Polkowski asks, do you estimate that recent advances in AI will skyrocket new medical device inventions? For instance, AI that can more intelligently monitor chronic diseases, connect with doctors, and make interventions independently?
Yes. I'll tell you something that I dreamt up that I still think you can do this if you want, because J&J, we didn't, because wisely, I think. So it was really around our consumer group back in the day when I was working with them. It was this idea that you have a magic mirror, a medical mirror. So when you wake up in the morning and you do your daily ablutions, whatever that word is, the mirror notices that maybe you have new acne and the type of acne. And then and you ask the mirror on the wall, why is my acne worst of all? And they come back and the mirror diagnoses you with cystic acne and hooks you up instantaneously or almost instantaneously with a dermatologist. And that dermatologist might, by chance or not some chance, prescribe Johnson & Johnson products for acne. I forget, I think it's Clearview or something like that. Or more serious, retinoids. So that kind of telemedicine combined with the ability to use very sophisticated diagnostic skills. So talk about AI, it would have to look at, and this gets into the area of data science, for a machine to know that you had acne and not something else, it would have to look at millions of faces with acne and millions of faces without or with something else before it could make a diagnosis. But that's what's happening. It's happening for radiology scans. It's happening for pathology slides where AI is used to make a pathologist more accurate and make a radiologist more accurate. It's spectacular, really.
But does it make you nervous at all that more and more people are probably going to self-diagnose using these tools on the internet?
Yeah, it makes me a little nervous. But at the end of the day, it's hard for a non-physician to prescribe.
Yeah.
So I think there's still going to be a checkpoint.
Okay. I think we have time for probably one more question here. So let's see. Oh, this is a perfect one. And you might not have the answer to this because, you know, sometimes when you're sitting in a big organization, you don't really know what another organization, how they operate. But Yi Lu asks, how would J&J's innovation strategy differentiate from competitors such as Merck or BMY?
Yeah, so great question. And I just happen to have the answer only because at the annual meeting of the American Association for Cancer Research, we had a day and a half of an oncology industry partnering meeting. And 12, I think, heads of R&D talked about their pipeline, how they build their pipeline, but it was a partnering meeting. And I was the moderator. And I asked them, so how do these people in the audience who want to partner with you, how do they do it? And I'll tell you, I was somewhat surprised that very few had set up the formal ways that we've done with the innovation centers, the J Labs, JJDC, BD. Most of them have BD, but they haven't moved out into the innovation ecosystems.
When you say BD, what does that stand for?
Business development.
Okay.
Business development, they're the groups that usually do mergers and acquisitions.
Okay.
But so I was surprised, actually. And part of it was companies that I know of, as people came to work for us, have tried to do what we did. But there's a problem within companies that the culture is that if it wasn't discovered in our labs, can't possibly be good.
Yeah.
That's a problem. That's a big problem.
Yeah. Not just in medicine. That's all over the place.
Yeah.
Well, I wish we could go on for another hour easily, but I am so grateful. This was such a fantastic talk, Bill, and I learned something. I'm sure everyone in our audience learned something. If we have more questions, we'll try to forward them to you. And I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge and your thoughts with us. It was very generous of you.
Thank you, Melissa. It was great to be invited, and I enjoyed the time.